In this video, we're going to cover the third option for how to export and import your environment assets, your props from Maya into UE5. And we will primarily focus on this option right here under File, Send to Unreal. And I'll cover all the options you need to know about how to set this up and how to quickly and easily export your assets using Send to Unreal. So let's get into it. Make sure, just like in the previous video, that you have your grid in Maya set up correctly to match Unreal Engine 5. So this way, everything you create in Maya translates to UE5 1:1 ratio. This is very important. Before you can use this option, you have to associate Maya project and link it to an existing UE5 project. So if you try to export anything right now by going to File, and let's say I want to do a full selection, so you go to File, Send to Unreal, you have an option for all, the entire scene, for a selection. And if I try to use any of these options right now, it will not work. You have to first set up your Unreal project. All this means is you have to have an existing project created for UE5, and then you have to link the Maya project to that Unreal project. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm gonna click Set Unreal Project and simply navigate to UE5 project stored on your computer. So I'm gonna go ahead and choose this one right here, UE5 tutorials, and you have to navigate into this folder right here inside the config, content, and all these other folders. And this is where actually the UE5 project, the file .u project is kept. And if you're not sure where your projects are stored, go to Epic Games Launcher, go to your My Project section. You can right click on the project thumbnail and go Show in Folder. And it's going to take you into that directory. So this is where you need to be, right where the .u project icon, this file right here is stored. And that's where you need to be in order to link Maya and UE5. So I'm already in this folder, so I'm simply going to be inside this folder and choose Select. And that's it. Now you have Maya linked up to that UE5 project. And those two options will now be available for you to use. So if you go to File and choose Send to Unreal, now you can either export the entire scene or a selection. So let's go through and export just a selection first. So I need to make a selection before I export. So let's say I just want to export this sphere. I'm going to go to File, Send to Unreal, Selection. The menu will pop up to export FBX. If you don't see this option, make sure under Files of Type, you've switched over to FBX Export. And if you do not see it in the drop-down menu, you need to enable under Windows, Settings and Preferences, Plugin Manager, make sure you have FBX Export, FBX Maya loaded and auto-loaded. Let me go ahead, go to File, Send to Unreal, and choose Selection again. And then choose a file name for your project, for your asset to export. So I'm going to type in Sphere. Now, the one important thing I want to point out is you can see already it linked into that project directory and into a folder. So Maya will create a folder called Import inside your UE5 project directory. And this is where it's going to place all of the assets. And if you try to change this directory, then you might as well use the other two options we covered earlier. Regular exports, either export all or export selection, and not use Send to Unreal. But this is a great option because it will put all of your FBX files that you export into UE5 project directory, into the import folder, and it will always place them there. So you don't have to look around for them or set a new location. You'll know exactly where all the FBX files are being exported into. As far as options for FBX export, for environment assets and props, for static meshes, I have under Geometry, Smoothing Groups enabled. This will ensure that the hard and soft edges are kept exactly how they are in Maya, and that data is translated into UE5. And Smooth Mesh enabled. This will ignore any smooth mesh preview that I have on my meshes. So if I press 3, either by choice or by accident inside Maya, where it smooths the mesh and gives me a subdivision preview version, only the polygon version will be exported of that mesh, not the smooth mesh preview. So this simply ensures that no subdivision smooth mesh preview is exported of your static meshes. And that's it, that's what I'm going to change. I'm going to let UE5 triangulate things for me on import, so I don't use the Maya version, I use UE5. And it does a pretty good job on everything. So once you name it, go ahead and export. Inside my project directory for UE5, you can see that I have the new folder, import. And then here is where the sphere.fbx has been exported. So all the meshes you export will be brought in here. Let's jump over into UE5 and import that mesh. Now you do have to still manually import them, go through the options for FBX import and import that mesh. So it's not going to automatically just place it into your project directory and import it for you. You still have to do the initial first import. So inside the content browser, I already have a folder created where I will import all the static meshes into. It's a great way to organize your content, so you're not looking for it. And if you need to create folders and organize your content folder and into your own folder, just simply select the folder where you want to create a new folder into. And inside this empty space, you can create new subfolders by right-clicking and choosing new folder and then rename it. Since I already have one, I'm just going to select it, and I can import two ways, just like in the previous two methods, by clicking add, going to import to, or just simply opening up that folder right here, going into the import, and then choosing my sphere and left click, hold and drag into the content browser. Now, of course, the menu will pop up. I'm going to reset this to default, and I'm just going to go through the same options we did before, but this way you'll know what the options are, so you don't have to reference the other two videos if you don't want to. So I'm going to reset to default, and I'm going to make sure I enable build nanites. So the mesh is using nanites, as nanites work great together with lumen. So if you are using lumen lighting, dynamic lighting, which most of the time you will, nanites work very good with lumen. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure this is enabled. This is a great option to use for all of your meshes, especially with lumen lighting, even if your prop is a low poly prop. It does not have to be high resolution prop to take advantage of nanites. Then everything else below, I'm going to keep the same. Make sure you open up advanced option to see more of the settings. Here, I want to make sure that I disable generate light map UVs. I don't want to use the light map UVs. Lumen lighting is dynamic lighting. And if you're using dynamic lighting, light map UVs are not required. Light map UVs is a second UV channel with a set of UVs where light and shadow information will be stored when you build lighting. So this is only used for static lights, if you have to build your lights manually by using static lighting rather than dynamic. If you're using static lighting, you need light map UVs. In my case, this is all dynamic, and Lumen is a dynamic lighting system, so I'm not going to generate light map UVs. So you can set this inside UE5 to generate light map UVs for you, or you can do it manually inside Maya. But this is a whole different set of principles and techniques that you have to follow, and it is its own separate video that would need to be covered to go through in detail for light maps. So I'm going to go ahead and disable it since we're using dynamic lights. Under combined meshes, I'm going to keep it disabled. Since this is only one single mesh, it will not matter here because all we're doing is exporting a single static mesh selection. But in the next option, when we export all, I'll show you what the differences are. Then everything else is going to be kept the same. And right below under material, you have an option to material import method. Do you want to create a material and then it will be assigned to that static mesh automatically? This is a very simple material with a constant array vector, and then that material gets applied to that static mesh. So it saves you an extra step of creating the material for you. Usually you'll create materials yourself manually, but in this first option, I'll leave this. I'll create new material. And that's it. I'm going to go ahead and hit import. Here I have a material created and a static mesh. So now I can drag that mesh right into the level, and it already has that default material that the UE5 created for us, which is right here, Lambert 1, which keeps the name of the material name from Maya. So if I open this up really quick, all it did was created a constant array vector, gave it a bit of color, and then plugged it into the base color. And that's it. See how simple this is? So then you would, of course, set up your own material structure with all the textures imported and whatever else you need. But again, it just saves you a step. And then it already applied this material onto this mesh at a static mesh editor level. So if you open up the static mesh editor by double clicking on that static mesh, here is the material that's assigned to that mesh. Now, one important part to know, just like in the previous videos, we went into detail on controlling your pivot points. So if you're doing a export selection, you can see that the pivot point is not really on an object. It's somewhere off in space. And that is because I exported this mesh without moving the object to the world origin at its pivot point. So the pivot point is always moved to world origin regardless of where the object is. So let's talk a little bit more about how to control your object better when you do a export selection. So you have full control where those pivot points are on an object when you bring them into UE5. So when it comes exporting a single static object, a selection. So let me go ahead and isolate this cube or this sphere, Control 1, So you can see that the pivot point on the sphere was actually in the center of the sphere. But when we export it, on export, this pivot point gets moved down to the world origin, this spot right here, 000 world space. And then when it's imported, that's where the pivot point was in UE5. You can see it right here. So it wasn't in the center anymore. It got moved down to world origin. So when you export a selection, a single object, you have to control these pivot points. So if you wanted to have this pivot point right in the center of the sphere like it was in Maya, you need to move this object at its pivot point to the world origin. So I'm going to hold down X and middle mouse click and drag so it's placed right in the center. So now the pivot point and the object are in the world origin. And if I go ahead and export this file, let's do the same thing, send to Unreal selection. I'm going to override this sphere and I'm going to keep the same options. Yes, I'm going to replace it. And in UE5, since we already imported this sphere once, you don't need to re-import by bringing up that menu by redragging. Although you could simply redrag that sphere back into content browser. Instead, I'm simply going to right click on the static mesh inside the content browser. I'm going to re-import. So it's going to re-import it and it's going to adjust that pivot point for me. And now you can see that it is exactly where it was in Maya, right in the center. So that control of pivot points and then placing that pivot point and object at its pivot point in the world origin is extremely important. So let's say you wanted to have this pivot point on the bottom. You need to snap that pivot point to the bottom of the sphere. So in this case, I'm going to hold down D, and by holding down D, I can modify the pivot point. You can also hit Insert key. Insert will toggle pivot point modification. So I'm going to hold down D, and I'm going to just snap this pivot point right to the bottom, right there on the bottom vertex. And now I need to move this object at its pivot point and place that pivot point in the world origin. And that's, I know, this will ensure that the pivot point and object is going to be exported and imported this way. So now if I go ahead and do one last export selection for this sphere, I am going to override this with all the same exact options. And I'm simply going to re-import. In this case, I'm going to re-import it this way by left click, hold and drag. So you get to see this. It's just going to re-import it for me. Since it retains the same name, UE5 knows that it just needs to re-import, not import it as a brand new object. And here's our sphere with the adjusted pivot point to the bottom of the sphere. So that is how you export a selection by using Send to Unreal. I'm going to go ahead and select the sphere, delete it, and then I'm going to select these two objects, the material and the static mesh inside the content browser, and hit delete. So we're going to remove everything. Now let's cover the second option, Send to Unreal by exporting all. Means it will export the entire scene. So in this method, I don't need to select anything. I just simply need to go to File, Send to Unreal, and choose All. What this will do is it will export every single piece of geometry inside this scene. So the entire scene will be exported into the FBX file. So let's go to File, Send to Unreal, and choose All. And I'm just going to name this full_scene. Avoid using spaces inside your name. And if you need a separation, just use underscore or a dash. For the export option, everything is going to be kept the same. Smoothing groups and smooth mesh enabled. And I'm going to let UE5 triangulate things for me. And then I'm going to hit export. So it's going to take this entire scene and export it into the FBX file. In UE5, I just need to re-import the same way. But in this case, I'm going to use a couple of different options. So I'm going to take this full scene and just left click, hold and drag into the folder of my choice. So the options here are going to be, I'm going to continue keeping build nanites on. I'm going to not generate live map PVs since we're using Lumen lighting. And the one option that I want to make sure to talk about is the combined meshes. So all the objects inside this scene are separate meshes. There are many different meshes here. Some are combined, like this wall, and some are individual meshes. So if I make sure to keep this disabled, which is off or disabled by default, this will bring in all those static meshes as separate static meshes, which is what I would want. But I'll cover what combined meshes means in a second in a variation of this. So I'm going to keep this off so everything is brought in as its own static mesh. Also at the very top, I want to generate missing collisions, which is on by default. What this means is UE5 will generate collisions for all of my meshes so they are blocked by the player. So the player cannot walk through them. And we'll be able to walk around and into our environment and walk on top of all the static meshes. So I'm going to keep this on. I usually keep this on unless I create one inside Maya and then import it. So for the sphere, we kept this on, and I'm going to keep this on for the entire scene as well. So every single static mesh that's going to be imported will have generate collisions created for us, which is great. Then further down, I am going to disable for this option. I'm not going to create, do not create material. Usually you create a material yourself and then you apply it to the object. So I'm going to disable this. If you do not create materials, also disable import textures. Unless you've created a material and assigned textures in Maya and you have those textures to be imported with the file, then you would enable this. But usually you import textures into UE5 yourself manually and not let the import options do this for you. So I'm not going to create material and I do not want to import textures. So now I'm going to hit import all. You're going to get an error. These errors are generated because you do not have any UVs on your objects. And none of these have been UV'd. So this is why I'm getting these two errors. So I'm going to ignore them because once you fix your UV issues, these errors will go away. So now you can see that the entire scene and all the static meshes, separate static meshes, have been imported. And now you could just drag each of these single meshes into your environment. However, the problem is as you can tell, the pivot point is in the world origin while the mesh is somewhere off in space. So this is a big problem, and this is not something you would use as this option if you are constructing your environment inside UE5. You would have to do a selection and export each individual mesh by placing it in the world origin and controlling that pivot point and where that pivot point is on the object. So whenever you export a larger scene, a huge selection, everything that's in the scene, it's best that you bring in all the meshes all at once. So by simply selecting all the meshes inside the content browser, left click, hold and drag into the environment. So this way you recreate what you had inside Maya and it's then recreated inside UE5. And if you happen to drag some static meshes away, a quick way to kind of get them back into that construction element, into that construction of the environment, you can simply select that static mesh and zero out the transformations, the transform location. And by zeroing them out, you essentially place them where they need to be. And you can actually do this on everything. So this way the entire scene is reconstructed and you can move them into that 000 world space at their pivot points. So I'm going to set this 000 to everything. And you can see the environment is going to get reconstructed. So this is a great option to use when you don't want to reconstruct your entire environment and you just want to focus working entirely in Maya and then just bring it into UE5, import all the meshes, and then just reconstruct them really quick and then just focus on lighting, texturing, applying materials, and creating the finished environment. So I really like this method if you want to stick primarily in Maya and not have to reconstruct it back in Unreal. Now, because all of these meshes are now separate and we brought them in as separate and we generated collisions, I can go ahead and spawn and I can run on top of all the geometry and we have proper collisions generated. Exception of a few little problems here and there, but then you'd be able to tweak those collisions if you need to. So if you need to tweak collisions after the fact, after you brought them in, just simply select the mesh. So let's see, let's just select this one. I'm gonna hit Control B to find that static mesh inside the content browser. If you double click, it'll open up static mesh editor. And then you go to show, simple collision, and just take a look at the collision that UE5 generated. So this is not very good. So you could use the in-game tools and generate a new collision for you by going to collisions and using any of these presets or using auto convex collision. That's a topic for another video, but you would adjust your collisions here or import one from Maya if you created a custom one in Maya and then import it into UE5. So this is a great option to use, like I said, for those of you who only want to focus on creating and detailing full scenes in Maya and then just simply bring them over into UE5 very quickly without having to reconstruct it. And the reason you would not want to reconstruct this entire scene is because of the pivot points. This is not ideal way of working. So if I wanted to expand on this environment and maybe create a bigger version of this and kind of have more, this is not a very good way to do so because you can see the pivot point is here. So in order to duplicate this, it would be very difficult. Alignment would be difficult. Staying on the grid, it becomes a pain. So don't use this method if you want to reconstruct your environment manually and expand on it. Also, one more small little adjustment. So whenever you are working by exporting the entire scene, you can see everything was exported individually. So we have all of these stairs as individual stairs. So in order to have them maybe as a solid unit instead of individual steps, you would combine things in Maya and then export all, and certain objects would be combined together, like this wall on the side. I had it combined in Maya, so it imported it as a single mesh. Wall here on the side was not combined in Maya, so they're all individual meshes. So very quickly, I'm going to go ahead and delete everything from here, and then I'm going to delete everything from the content browser. And then I'm going to select the stairs, and let me deselect everything else that I don't need, and I'm going to combine all of these in Maya, so you get to see that they're going to be brought in as a single mesh. So I'm going to go to Mesh, Combine, and let's export the entire scene again. File, Send to Unreal, All. I'm going to override the full scene with all the same exact options, and I'm going to bring in that full scene. I'm going to keep all the options here the same as before, import, and let me close this down. So now we have these stairs as one single mesh. Now the collisions for this are not going to be good. So you will have to deal with this, you will have to regenerate collisions using another method in UE5 or in Create One in Maya. But this way I have less meshes to deal with. Instead of individual steps, I now have a single asset for the steps. Let me go ahead and undo, and I'm going to delete this again. And I'm going to re-import it. So what I want to show you is the combine meshes option. It's important that for this option you do not combine meshes unless you want to, but then you're going to have a whole set of problems to deal with separately, specifically with dealing with lumen lighting. So I'm going to re-bring the scene over in again, and the only thing I'm going to change here is combine meshes. So now it will take all the meshes inside that FBX file. It will not keep them separate. It will combine them into one single mesh. So everything will become one static mesh. So I'm going to hit import all. And you can see here, I'm going to ignore these issues. This is UV errors. I'm going to ignore them. So now you can see that this static mesh is a single static mesh. Everything has been combined into one. So I'm going to drag this in. The scene is recreated, which is great, but it's now we have problems. Number one is the collisions. If I go ahead and spawn, I won't be able to walk through this because it's one single static mesh. So UE5 generates like a big box as its collision. And I'm going to show you a quick way to where you can overcome that at some performance cost. But then another problem we have is because it's one single large static mesh, Lumen will not light this properly. You're going to have a lot of lighting artifacts. Lumen works best when you have smaller meshes that are created together like we did before when we exported all, but we did not combine. And Lumen works best when it's lighting your environment with smaller meshes constructed together rather than one single mesh. So keep that in mind. Lumen does not like large, massive meshes and will have problem lighting it. And now, in order to fix something like this for collisions, if you open up the static mesh editor and let's take a look at the collisions. Let's go to show, simple collision. You can see it generated a large hole. So to overcome this, we can either ignore and delete all collisions, but then you won't be able to walk on any of your meshes. But let's say you want to have something like this and you also want to be able to walk through your environment, then you can enable using complex collision as simple. Complex collision uses per poly collision, and it is expensive to use because now it's calculating per poly. Everything is per poly rather than more simplified collision holes. But you will be able to walk through your environment. So if it's not for a playable environment, you could probably activate this and use this for like a standalone environment that's just a walkthrough and it's not going to be playable. So to change this, you just scroll down until you find collision, and under collision complexity, project default, change this to use complex collision as simple. And now jump back into your level. And now if I spawn, and actually let me spawn a different way. Well, now right click, play from here. Now I'll be able to walk through this environment. I mean, it's using per poly collision, so everything is very, very good in terms of collision. Everything is very detailed. But again, it comes at a performance cost. So if you want to go ahead and disable this, just go back to collision preset using project default. So these are the options of using File, Send to Unreal, either All or Selection. And it's one of the three options you could use to export your static meshes from Maya into UE5. Now, if you want to learn how to model your own environment assets, your own custom static meshes in Maya, completely from scratch without any Maya experience to start with, then you need to get the Maya Foundation Home Static course. It breaks everything down from complete beginning, shows you how to use Maya, then you'll learn how to model your objects using various poly modeling tools, and then it will show you how to begin UV in your objects so you can texture them. So you can get access to Maya Foundation, the Home Static course now. And if you want to learn UE5 completely from scratch as a beginner in just 11 hours, then download and begin watching UE5 Fundamentals Volume 1, the Essential Beginner's Guide to getting started creating environments in UE5 and lighting them. And you can get UE5 Fundamentals Volume 1 now.